こんばんは。京都学の母校京都大学にお招きいただきありがとうございます。安倍先生、藤田先生にお礼申し上げます。そして皆さん本日はお越しいただきありがとうございます。今日ここでお話できて光栄です。ただ日本語では英語での発表になることをご了承ください。それでは始めさせていただきます。So let me now switch to English so that you can understand me. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. So I was asked to present something to a non-philosophical audience, even though I think that many of you are from philosophy. So I was thinking about what might be a good topic, and in a way this presentation can be understood as extending a little bit of what Abe Sensei, Matthias Fritsch and I have been doing together, namely thinking about nature, in a way also time and responsibility, in a context that draws on different cultural traditions. So we see here, we find at least the responsibility part and the nature part, and I will be comparing and contrasting, but also showing similarities between different conceptions of wisdom, human as well as animal wisdom in this talk. So the outline of this talk is as follows. Since the title of this lecture requires some explanation, let me begin by speaking a little bit about human wisdom as limit consciousness first. I will be going back to perhaps the most classical text from Western philosophy, where the wisdom concept of wisdom was being developed, namely Socrates' Apology, and then in the discuss what wisdom means there, namely a certain kind of limit consciousness, or what I will call a minimal conception of wisdom, which I think has certain promising parts, but I will also be criticizing this in the second part of this lecture, where then I will look at the role of animal wisdom. So, and I will be giving a big, far too big panorama of different images of animal wisdom that we find in Western, not only philosophy, but also literature as well as art. So I will also be drawing on a couple of artworks. So if you don't understand me, then hopefully at least these artworks will be appealing to you. And then in the third part of the lecture, I will be discussing so-called wisdom animals in the Taoist classic Zhuangzi, one of the two most famous Taoist texts, and look at the function that animals have, in my opinion, in this very important text from the Chinese philosophical canon. And finally, I will return to the beginning, as it were, and briefly raise the question concerning the relationship between human and animal wisdom. So from its inception, at least in the classical European tradition, the wisdom that the philosopher, that means a certain kind of human being, longs for, has been presented by way of a comparison. Socrates, who in a way both embodied wisdom and invented the discourse about what it might mean to be a wise person, proposes a specific manner of approaching wisdom, or Sophia, in the dialogue The Apology. We need to keep in mind that Socrates is speaking to us through the words given to him by his student Plato, of course. After being proclaimed to be the wisest person in Athens by the oracle of Delphi, Socrates tries to disprove the oracle by going around Athens to find human beings who are wiser than him. He compares himself to others to determine whether the oracle, in contrast to his self-proclaimed opinion, might be right after all. By going around the city of Athens and testing the wisdom of politicians, poets, as well as craftsmen, highly recognized professions at the time, Socrates exposes that while there is occasional genius to be found in, for example, the beauty of a work of art, the skill of a craftsman, or the sense of power that a politician has, the claim to wisdom of these people exercising these respective professions turns out to be at best narrow. They might be knowledgeable in specific domains, but this is not quite the same as being wise. The claim by any of the politicians, poets, and craftsmen that they are wise is a sign of mere presumptuousness and vanity, of overstepping the domain of what they indeed do know. If anything, they inhabit islands of knowledge that they mistakenly consider to be more than islands. What distinguishes Socrates' ironic wisdom from the other contenders for wisdom is his paradoxical awareness of the limits of what he knows. Thus, Socrates states in the perhaps most well-known statement in the history of Western philosophy, in the words given to him by his student Plato, "I know that I don't know," or more accurately, "I do not think I know what I do not know." In the Socratic tradition, human wisdom consists in a form of knowledge that is aware of its own limits. We can call it a minimalist account of wisdom that is distinguished from other accounts of wisdom, for example, having profound insights into the nature of reality or a particularly good sense of judgment. From Socrates' minimalist definition, we can already see that, as simple as it may appear, wisdom is a rather complex issue. Arguably the highest of virtues, a person of wisdom has a specific kind of self-awareness. What distinguishes wisdom from other forms of awareness and knowledge is that it includes a consciousness of the limits of one's knowledge. More broadly speaking, wisdom consists in the self-reflective capacity of putting one's present standpoint or one's perspective, including one's most considered convictions, values, and judgments, into perspective. The person who is wise knows about the limits of his knowledge without thereby necessarily claiming to possess a different kind or a higher form of knowledge. In this sense, wisdom is an awareness of a limit and presupposes a shift in self-consciousness. Negatively stated, the wise person is someone who breaks with the all-too-human tendency of considering his respective convictions, beliefs, or skills to be absolutely true, universally applicable, and of ultimate importance. In contrast, the wise person acknowledges that her way of viewing the world is not the only game in town. She acknowledges the contingency and finitude of her beliefs when compared to other possible forms of wisdom. In other words, the wise person decenters her perspective on the world, including her own position in this world, with regard to other possible perspectives and alternative centers. The capacity for putting her way of viewing the world into perspective can only be accomplished in light of one's awareness of the existence or possible existence of other perspectives, both actual, possible, and imagined ones. By putting her perspective into perspective, the person of wisdom engages in a paradoxical task. The more she knows about what she does not know, just as an increasing diameter of a circle corresponds to an increase of the empty area bordering its circumference. Wisdom understood as limiting one's claim to knowledge by imagining other alternative perspectives comes in different degrees and shapes, and is not an all or nothing affair. Philosophers in particular have a complex relationship to wisdom. By definition, as seekers of wisdoms, they do not claim to be wise. Yet they cannot be fully ignorant of wisdom either, or they would not be philosophers. Claiming to have wisdom, just as being immune to wisdom's lure, would be a sign of philosophical failure. Moreover, it would be an existential failure for the philosophical form of human life. The philosopher crucially depends on a constitutive tension to wisdom. She has to aim or desire for wisdom as the highest good, while also keeping distance from the arrogance of claiming to have achieved or reached wisdom. Claiming to be wise, or even claiming to be a philosopher, disqualifies this claim and means that one commits a performative contradiction. For these reasons, Socrates thus needed the priestess Pythia to call him wise and his student Plato to tell us about this founding myth of Western philosophy in an even more indirect manner. One crucial feature that has accompanied philosophy from its inception is this limit consciousness. In contemporary terminology, one could speak of a second-order awareness that supervenes on and alters the status of primary beliefs, desires, and convictions of someone aspiring to wisdom. The question emerges whether the second-order awareness or second-order skepticism is not purchased for the price of adopting new forms of blindness. And in a way, this talk will be could also be entitled The Philosopher's Blindness, because the rest of the talk is trying to deconstruct Socrates' project as I introduced it. Socrates' blind spot is that he considers his mission from a perspective that takes it all too seriously, a matter of life and death. Taking the philosophical quest for wisdom a bit too far, he willfully stages the acceptance of his death sentence given to him by the city of Athens as resulting from his unconditional commitment to searching for wisdom. He thereby negates the inherent ambivalence that characterizes philosophy's flirt with wisdom. To quote Theodor W. Adorno, a member of the Frankfurt School that Abe Sensei mentioned in the beginning, philosophy is the most serious of things, but then again, it is not that serious. Socrates' quest was not only too serious, but also a provocation. Nobody would like to be exposed to a philosopher, even to Socrates, recommendation that one is not really wise. Claiming to understand the limits of your knowledge better than others can also be a form of pretentiousness and arrogance. This kind of philosophical hubris, blind spot, or pretense can be seen and potentially addressed by decentering human wisdom in comparison to other forms of non-human wisdom. We have already stated at the outset that wisdom is a comparative notion in which the person comes to be aware of the limits of his perspective. Drawing such a limit requires an awareness of an outside of one's perspective. This raises the question, what is outside of the limits of Socrates' wisdom? I will suggest in this talk that wisdom understood as a limit consciousness requires comparing the human perspective to a perspective that is significantly different, even though there are certain similarities, from what is merely human. The limit of wisdom becomes particularly visible, or the limit of human wisdom becomes particularly visible, I will suggest during the second part that I will turn to now of this talk, when comparing human wisdom to that of animals. Socrates already distinguishes human wisdom from other forms of wisdom. The Oracle of Delphi, which was communicated to the priest Pythia by way of snakes, mentions that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. This diminishing of human wisdom to something in between little and nothing raises the question what other forms of non-human wisdom there might be and what kind of claims they make. And for this talk, I presuppose that Socrates was not primarily thinking of divine wisdom. Socrates himself does not explain what these other forms of wisdom are, but he does give us a clue. In the following section, I will approach the topic what wisdom might be, not by pursuing the Socratic comparison between the wisdom of the philosopher and the wisdom of other forms of human life, but by turning to the animal, or rather particular representations of animal wisdom instead. So the method I will be drawing on, and actually the inspiration I will be drawing on, is a little book that was published from the Blumenberg archives. So Professor Abe mentioned I first studied in Münster in Germany, and the main philosopher there, even though he died when I arrived, was Hans Blumenberg. And he is very well known for tracing different metaphors and arguing that we think by way of using certain metaphors that cannot be absolutely translated into non-metaphorical language. He interestingly also applied this approach to lions. And so I very much enjoyed reading this little book that was published out of his Nachlass about lions. And here I will not be speaking about lions, but I will be speaking mostly about birds. But in the background is this Bloomberg approach to metaphors as having certain functions in explaining to us the world in different ways than mere concepts might do. If my intuition is right, animals embody different ways of seeing and existing in the world. Socrates himself gives an important clue that reveals the importance of animal metaphors when it comes to the difficult task of approaching wisdom. Not rarely is he dressed in rags and presented as the inspiration for the dog philosophers that came to be known as the philosophical school of the Cynics afterwards. Interestingly, Socrates himself identifies himself as a gadfly, an annoying insect that, in spite of its small size, irritates and itches. Athens is compared to a somewhat oversized and sluggish horse in need of the right amount of philosophical irritation.